Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're traveling to the vast expanse of Russia's Sverdlovsk Oblast, where between 2002 and 2010, a woman's desperate addiction would lead to one of the most chilling murder sprees in modern Russian criminal history. This is the story of Irina Viktorovna Gaidamichuk, a woman who would become known by the haunting nickname, Satan in a Skirt. Her crimes would shock a nation and leave an indelible mark on the small communities where she operated. Picture, if you will, the industrial landscape of the Urals region in Russia. The year is 2002, and the post-Soviet era has left many communities struggling with economic hardship and social upheaval. In this challenging environment, elderly residents often lived alone, vulnerable and isolated, relying on the kindness of strangers and the occasional visit from social workers to help them navigate their daily lives. The town of Krasnofimsk, nestled in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, was home to many such elderly residents. These were women who had lived through the tumultuous changes of the 20th century, who had survived wars, political upheavals, and economic uncertainties. They lived in modest apartments, often alone, with little more than their pensions to sustain them. It was in this setting that Irina Gaidamichuk would begin her deadly campaign. Irina Viktorovna Gaidamichuk was born on May 22, 1972, in the town of Nyagin, located in the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Region of Russia. From the outside, she appeared to be an ordinary woman navigating the challenges of post-Soviet life. She was married, lived in the community, and to her neighbors, she seemed unremarkable. But beneath this facade lurked a growing addiction that would eventually consume her life and the lives of 17 innocent women. Irina had developed a severe alcohol dependency, a problem that would drive her to increasingly desperate measures to fund her addiction. Her husband, recognizing the destructive nature of her drinking, had made the difficult decision to refuse giving her money for alcohol. This created a desperate situation for Irina, who found herself cut off from her primary source of funding for her addiction. It was this desperation that would set in motion the events that would make her one of Russia's most prolific female serial killers. What made Irina Gaidamichuk's crimes particularly insidious was the calculated method she employed to gain access to her victims. She understood the vulnerability of elderly women living alone, and she exploited their trust in the most callous way imaginable. Irina would present herself as a social worker, a housing official, or someone offering to help with household chores and errands. In a society where such assistance was often desperately needed, elderly women would welcome her into their homes without suspicion. She had mastered the art of appearing helpful and trustworthy, using society's expectation of compassion to mask her deadly intentions. Once inside these modest apartments, Irina would reveal her true nature. She would attack her victims with whatever weapon was available, sometimes an axe, sometimes a hammer, other times household items like vases. The brutality of these attacks was shocking, as she would bludgeon these elderly women to death in their own homes, the very places where they should have felt safest. After committing these horrific murders, Irina would search through her victims' belongings, taking whatever small amounts of money she could find. These were not wealthy women, the amounts she stole were often pitifully small, sometimes equivalent to just £20 or less. But for Irina, driven by her addiction, any amount was worth killing for. The 17 women who lost their lives to Irina Gaidamichuk were all elderly, all vulnerable, and all alone. They had trusted a woman who appeared to offer help, only to have that trust betrayed in the most violent way possible. These women had lived full lives, had families, had dreams and memories. They had survived decades of hardship, only to have their lives cut short by someone who saw them as nothing more than a means to an end. Each murder was a tragedy, not just for the individual victim, but for their families and the communities that mourned their loss. What made these crimes particularly heartbreaking was the complete randomness of the victim selection. Irina didn't choose these women based on any personal grudge or specific criteria beyond their vulnerability. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when a desperate woman came knocking at their door. For years, the murders went unsolved. The police in the Sverdlovsk Oblast were dealing with what appeared to be a series of brutal but seemingly unconnected crimes. Each murder scene told a similar story: an elderly woman found dead in her apartment, evidence of a struggle, and small amounts of money missing. But connecting these crimes to a single perpetrator proved challenging. The investigation was complicated by several factors. First, the victims were all elderly and lived alone, which meant that the crimes were often not discovered immediately. Second, the apparent randomness of the killings made it difficult to establish a pattern. And third, Irina's method of posing as a helpful social worker meant that she didn't stand out as suspicious to potential witnesses. As the body count rose, law enforcement began to recognize that they were dealing with a serial killer. The similarities between the crimes became too obvious to ignore: the victim profile, the method of entry, the brutal attacks, and the theft of small amounts of money all pointed to a single perpetrator. By 2010, the investigation had intensified significantly. The police had begun to piece together the pattern of the attacks and were actively looking for suspects. They had established that the killer was someone who could easily gain the trust of elderly women, someone who appeared non-threatening and helpful. The breakthrough came with what would tragically prove to be Irina's final victim. Alexandra Povarytsina, an elderly woman living alone in her apartment, became the 17th and last victim of Irina Gaidamichuk's killing spree. But unlike the previous murders, this one would not go unnoticed. A neighbor had observed Irina leaving the building around the time of the murder. This witness observation would prove to be the key that law enforcement needed to finally solve the case. When the police received the information from Alexandra Povarytsina's neighbor, they moved quickly to arrest Irina Gaidamichuk. The description provided by the witness matched other reports they had received about a woman posing as a social worker in the area. What happened next would shock even seasoned investigators. When confronted with the evidence, Irina didn't deny her crimes or try to construct an elaborate defense. Instead, she confessed almost immediately to the killings. During her confession, Irina revealed the motive behind her crimes with a chilling matter-of-factness. She explained that she had committed the murder robberies to pay for vodka to feed her alcohol addiction. Her husband's refusal to give her money for alcohol had driven her to these desperate measures. She described how she would use the money stolen from her victims to purchase alcohol, and when that money ran out, she would seek out another victim. The trial of Irina Gaidamichuk took place in a court in Ekaterinburg, the largest city in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. The proceedings attracted significant media attention, as the Russian public struggled to understand how a woman could commit such horrific crimes against some of society's most vulnerable members. During the trial, the full extent of Irina's crimes became clear. The prosecution presented evidence of 17 murders, each one more senseless than the last. The defense attempted to argue that her addiction had diminished her capacity for rational thought, but the calculated nature of her crimes suggested otherwise. The methodical way in which Irina had approached each murder, the careful selection of victims, the use of deception to gain entry, and the systematic theft of money afterward, all pointed to someone who was fully aware of their actions and their consequences. On June 12, 2012, Irina Gaidamichuk was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Many observers felt that this sentence was insufficient given the scope and brutality of her crimes. For taking 17 lives, she would serve approximately 1 year and 2 months for each murder. The case of Irina Gaidamichuk sent shockwaves through Russian society. The idea that a woman could commit such violent crimes, particularly against elderly victims, challenged many people's preconceptions about female criminality. The Russian media dubbed her Satan in a skirt, a nickname that captured the public's horror at her crimes. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of elderly people living alone in post-Soviet Russia. Many communities began to implement better safety measures for their elderly residents, including more robust verification procedures for social workers and other service providers. For the families of the victims, the sentence brought some measure of closure, but could never truly heal the wounds left by these senseless murders. 17 families had lost their mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers to a woman whose addiction had consumed not only her own life but the lives of so many others. Criminal psychologists studying the case of Irina Gaydamachuk have noted several disturbing aspects of her crimes. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by psychological compulsions or sexual motives, Irina was motivated purely by her need to fund her addiction. This made her crimes particularly calculating and cold-blooded. She didn't kill because she enjoyed it or because she was driven by uncontrollable urges. She killed because she needed money, and elderly women living alone were easy targets who were unlikely to be able to defend themselves. The systematic nature of her approach, the consistent use of deception, the targeting of the same demographic, and the methodical theft of money, all point to someone who was fully aware of what she was doing and was capable of planning and executing these crimes with chilling efficiency. The case of Irina Gaydamachuk occurred during a time when Russia was still grappling with the social and economic aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. Alcoholism had become a significant problem in many communities, and the social safety net for vulnerable populations was often inadequate. This context doesn't excuse Irina's crimes, but it does help explain how someone could fall so deeply into addiction that they would resort to murder. The lack of adequate treatment programs for addiction, combined with the economic hardships many people faced, created conditions where desperate people might turn to desperate measures. The targeting of elderly women also reflected broader social issues. In post-Soviet Russia, many elderly people lived alone, often forgotten by overwhelmed social services and struggling families. This isolation made them perfect targets for someone like Irina, who was looking for victims who were unlikely to be missed immediately. The investigation into Irina Gaydamachuk's crimes was complicated by several factors that are common in cases involving elderly victims. First, the murders were often not discovered immediately, as the victims lived alone and had limited social contact. This meant that crime scenes were sometimes compromised by the time they were discovered. Second, the random nature of the victim selection made it difficult for investigators to predict where the next attack might occur. Unlike serial killers who target specific types of victims in predictable locations, Irina's crimes seemed to occur wherever she found an opportunity. Third, the method of gaining entry, posing as a social worker, was particularly insidious because it exploited the trust that elderly people placed in social services. This made it difficult for potential witnesses to identify suspicious behavior, as Irina's presence in apartment buildings and interactions with elderly residents would have seemed completely normal. Alexandra Povoritsina, the woman who would become Irina's final victim, was living alone in her apartment when she encountered the woman who claimed to be there to help her. Like the 16 women before her, Alexandra trusted this stranger who appeared at her door offering assistance. What happened next followed the same brutal pattern that had characterized all of Irina's previous crimes. But this time, there was a witness who saw Irina leaving the building. This observation would prove to be the key that would finally bring Irina's killing spree to an end. It's both tragic and ironic that it took 17 murders before a witness came forward with information that led to Irina's arrest. One can only wonder how many lives might have been saved if someone had noticed her suspicious behavior earlier in her criminal career. When Irina Gaydamachuk was arrested and questioned about the murders, her confession was notable for its lack of emotion or remorse. She described her crimes in matter-of-fact terms, explaining her actions as simply a means to an end. She needed money for alcohol, elderly women were easy targets, and killing them was the most efficient way to get what she needed. This coldness was perhaps more disturbing than if she had shown signs of mental illness or psychological disturbance. It suggested that she was fully aware of the gravity of her actions but had simply decided that other people's lives were worth less than her next drink. During her confession, Irina provided details about each murder that helped investigators close cases that had remained unsolved for years. Her memory of the crimes was remarkably clear, suggesting that despite her addiction, she had been fully present and aware during each attack. The 20-year sentence that Irina Gedamachuk received was controversial in Russia, with many people feeling that it was insufficient for such heinous crimes. Under Russian law at the time, the maximum sentence for murder was 20 years, and life imprisonment was only available for certain types of aggravated murder. Some legal experts argued that Irina's case should have qualified for a life sentence given the number of victims and the particularly vulnerable nature of those she targeted. Others pointed out that the systematic nature of her crimes and her complete lack of remorse suggested that she would remain a danger to society even after serving her sentence. The sentence meant that Irina would be eligible for release when she was in her early 60s, still young enough to potentially pose a threat to others. This prospect was particularly disturbing given her apparent lack of remorse and the calculating nature of her crimes. The case of Irina Gedamachuk has had a lasting impact on Russian society and criminal justice. It highlighted the particular vulnerability of elderly people living alone and led to increased awareness about the need for better protection for this population. The case also contributed to ongoing discussions about how to address alcohol addiction in Russia, where alcoholism remains a significant social problem. While addiction doesn't excuse criminal behavior, Irina's case demonstrated how untreated addiction can lead to increasingly desperate and violent acts. For law enforcement, the case provided valuable lessons about investigating crimes against elderly victims and the importance of recognizing patterns in seemingly random attacks. It also highlighted the need for better communication between different police departments and jurisdictions when dealing with serial crimes. The story of Irina Gedamachuk is one of the most disturbing in the annals of Russian criminal history. It's a tale of how addiction can transform an ordinary person into a cold-blooded killer, how trust can be exploited for evil purposes, and how the most vulnerable members of society can become prey for those who see them as nothing more than a means to an end. The 17 women who lost their lives to Irina's addiction deserved so much better. They deserved to live out their final years in peace and dignity, surrounded by people who cared for them. Instead, they became victims of someone who valued their lives less than the price of a bottle of vodka. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded of the importance of looking out for our elderly neighbors and community members. We're also reminded that addiction is a serious disease that requires treatment and support, not judgment and abandonment. The case of Irina Gedamachuk, the woman known as Satan in a skirt, stands as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, and the tragic consequences when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet suburbs of Rescaldina, just outside Milan, Italy, where the gentle hum of everyday life masked the darkness that would soon unfold, lived a young woman whose vibrant spirit would be forever silenced by someone she trusted. This is the story of Carol Maltese, known to many as Charlotte Angie, a tale that reveals how the most dangerous predators often hide behind the masks of ordinary neighbors. Carol Angie Deborah Maltese was 26 years old when her life was cut short in the winter of 2022. Born to Italian and Dutch parents, she possessed a rare combination of beauty, wanderlust, and fierce maternal devotion that defined her existence. Carol had already visited 26 different countries, each journey feeding her insatiable appetite for adventure and new experiences. She spoke often of her dreams to see more of the world, to show her 6-year-old son the wonders that lay beyond their quiet Italian town. Before the pandemic changed everything, Carol worked as a sales assistant at a perfume shop, surrounded by the delicate scents of French fragrances and Italian elegance. She was known among her colleagues as someone who wasn't easily embarrassed, who had made her own choices in life and stood by them with quiet confidence. When COVID-19 brought lockdowns and economic uncertainty, Carol, like many others, found herself searching for new ways to support herself and her beloved son. It was during this time that Carol entered the adult entertainment industry, working under the stage name Charlotte Angie. This wasn't a decision made lightly or carelessly, it was a calculated choice by a mother who needed to provide for her child during uncertain times. Those who knew her described her as unashamed of her work, someone who had made her own decisions and wasn't seeking anyone's approval or judgment. Carol's apartment in Rescaldina became both her home and her workplace. The quiet neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and modest buildings, seemed like the perfect place to raise a child. Her neighbors included families, professionals, and among them, a 43-year-old bank employee named Davide Fontana who lived nearby. Davide Fontana appeared to be everything one might expect from a suburban bank employee. He was well-dressed, punctual, and maintained the kind of respectable facade that made him blend seamlessly into the fabric of middle-class Italian life. His colleagues at the bank knew him as reliable and professional, the kind of person who handled other people's money with precision and care. But beneath this ordinary exterior, Fontana harbored an obsession that would prove deadly. He had developed feelings for his neighbor Carol that went far beyond casual attraction. In his mind, their interactions had taken on a significance that existed only in his imagination. He believed they were in a relationship, that their connection was deeper and more meaningful than it actually was. The reality was far different. To Carol, Fontana was simply a neighbor, someone she might nod to in the hallway or exchange pleasantries with in passing. She had no idea that in his mind, he was constructing an elaborate fantasy about their future together. This dangerous delusion would eventually lead to tragedy, but in the quiet winter days of early 2022, Carol remained unaware of the storm brewing in the apartment next door. January 10 or 11, 2022, the exact date would later become a point of investigation, began like any other day in Carol's life. She was preparing for what she believed would be a routine work session, creating content for her adult entertainment platform. What she didn't know was that her neighbor Davide Fontana would be involved, and that his participation would be driven by motivations far more sinister than she could have imagined. According to Fontana's later confession to the Carabinieri, he and Carol were filming what he described as a hard film. The details of how this arrangement came about remain unclear, but what is certain is that Carol found herself in a vulnerable position, tied up, with a bag over her head, trusting someone she believed was helping her with her work. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Fontana's fantasy collided with reality in the most violent way possible. As Carol lay restrained and defenseless, Fontana began striking her with a hammer. His later confession would reveal the calculated nature of his actions. He started by hitting her body, not hard, as he would later tell investigators, but as he worked his way up to her head, the blows became more forceful. "She moved and I kept hitting her," Fontana would later confess, his words revealing the cold calculation behind his actions. But this was not a crime of passion or a moment of sudden rage, it was a deliberate, methodical killing that would continue long after Carol had stopped moving. Even after the initial attack, Fontana wasn't finished. In what he would later describe as an act of mercy, he slit Carol's throat, telling investigators, "I cut her throat to help her." This chilling statement would later become a key piece of evidence in understanding the depths of his delusion and the calculating nature of his crime. With Carol's lifeless body before him, Fontana faced a choice that would reveal the true extent of his depravity. Rather than calling for help, rather than facing the consequences of his actions, he chose to compound his crime with acts that would shock even seasoned investigators. Fontana made the decision to dismember Carol's body, cutting it into 15 separate pieces. This wasn't the work of someone overcome by panic or emotion, it was the methodical work of someone who had thought through the practical problems of concealing a murder. He carefully packaged the pieces into garbage bags, treating the remains of a woman who had once dreamed of traveling the world as nothing more than waste to be disposed of. But Fontana's plan went beyond simple concealment. He placed the dismembered remains in his freezer, where they would stay for the next 2 months. During this time, he continued his normal life, going to work at the bank, greeting neighbors, maintaining the facade of the respectable professional he had always appeared to be. All the while, the evidence of his horrific crime was preserved in his kitchen freezer, a macabre secret hidden behind the door of an ordinary appliance. While Carol's body lay frozen in Fontana's apartment, her absence from the world began to create ripples that would eventually expose his crime. But Fontana wasn't content to simply wait and hope that no one would notice Carol's disappearance. Instead, he embarked on an elaborate deception designed to make it appear that Carol was still alive. Using Carol's phone, Fontana began sending messages to her friends and family, crafting communications that were designed to explain her absence without raising suspicion. He told people that Carol had decided to move to Verona with her 6-year-old son, that she was starting a new life in a new city. For those who knew Carol's love of travel and her desire for new experiences, this explanation seemed plausible. The deception was sophisticated in its simplicity. Fontana understood that people would accept a story that fit with what they already knew about Carol's character. Her wanderlust, her independence, her willingness to make bold decisions, all of these traits made the story of a sudden move to Verona seem believable to those who received the messages. For weeks, this digital charade continued. Friends and family members received regular updates about Carol's new life, her happiness in Verona, her plans for the future. All the while, her body remained in Fontana's freezer, a grim reminder of the reality behind the lies. As winter turned to spring in 2022, Fontana knew that he couldn't keep Carol's remains frozen indefinitely. The practical realities of his situation were becoming impossible to ignore. In March, he made the decision to dispose of the body, choosing a ravine in the Brescia area, far from Rescaldina, where he hoped the remains would never be found. On a quiet Sunday, Fontana loaded the garbage bags containing Carol's dismembered body into his car and drove to the remote location he had selected. The ravine seemed perfect for his purposes, isolated, rarely visited, the kind of place where evidence could remain hidden for years or even decades. But Fontana had underestimated the forces of nature. As the weather warmed and the bags began to thaw, the contents became visible to anyone who might pass by. It was a discovery that would change everything: 15 packages containing the remains of a young woman, carefully wrapped but now exposed to the elements and to the eyes of investigators. The discovery was made by local residents who immediately contacted the police. The sight that greeted investigators was one that would haunt them for years to come: the carefully dismembered remains of someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone whose life had been cut short by unimaginable violence. The investigation into the identity of the dismembered remains began immediately. Italian authorities, experienced in handling complex criminal cases, approached the evidence with the methodical precision that would eventually lead them to the truth. The remains were clearly those of a young woman, but establishing her identity would require careful forensic work and detective investigation. As investigators worked to identify the victim, they began to piece together the circumstances that had led to her death. The careful dismemberment suggested someone with either professional knowledge or significant premeditation. The remote location of the disposal site indicated that the killer had planned carefully, choosing a spot far from any potential crime scene. Meanwhile, the absence of Carol Maltese was beginning to attract more attention. While her digital communications had initially satisfied friends and family, the lack of any real contact began to raise questions. Carol's father, in particular, became increasingly concerned about his daughter's silence and the strange circumstances surrounding her reported move to Verona. It was this growing concern that led to the filing of a missing persons report in mid-March, nearly 2 months after Carol's actual death. The timing of this report, combined with the discovery of the remains in Brescia, would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire investigation. As investigators worked to identify the remains found in Brescia, they simultaneously began looking into Carol's disappearance from Rescaldina. The two investigations, initially separate, began to converge in ways that would prove devastating to Fontana's carefully constructed deception. The digital trail left by Carol's phone became a crucial piece of evidence. Investigators were able to trace the messages that had been sent from her device, revealing patterns and inconsistencies that suggested someone else was responsible for the communications. The language used in the messages, the timing of the communications, and the lack of any video calls or voice messages all pointed to a deception. When investigators compared the location data from Carol's phone with the timeline of her supposed move to Verona, they found discrepancies that couldn't be explained by innocent circumstances. The phone had remained in the Milan area long after Carol was supposedly settled in her new home, suggesting that someone local was still using the device. As the investigation intensified, attention naturally turned to Carol's neighbors and associates in Rescaldina. Fontana, as someone who lived in the same building and had interacted with Carol, became a person of interest. When investigators began asking questions about Carol's disappearance, they found inconsistencies in Fontana's story that raised immediate red flags. Under questioning by investigators, Fontana initially maintained his innocence, supporting the story that Carol had moved to Verona and expressing appropriate concern for her well-being. But as evidence mounted and the inconsistencies in his story became more apparent, the pressure began to take its toll. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Fontana had been using Carol's phone to send the messages that had convinced everyone she was still alive. Faced with this evidence, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. On March 29, 2022, after hours of questioning, Fontana finally confessed to killing Carol Maltesi. The confession was both shocking and chilling in its detail. Fontana described the events of January 10 or 11 with a precision that suggested the actions had been replaying in his mind for months. He explained how he had convinced Carol to participate in what he described as a hard film, how he had restrained her, and how he had then systematically killed her with a hammer. But perhaps most disturbing was Fontana's description of his motivations. He told investigators that he had been in love with Carol, that he had believed they were in a relationship, and that he had felt used and betrayed by her work in the adult entertainment industry. His confession revealed a man who had constructed an elaborate fantasy about their relationship and had then punished Carol for failing to live up to his delusions. As investigators delved deeper into Fontana's confession and the evidence surrounding the crime, the true motive for Carol's murder began to emerge. This wasn't a random act of violence or a crime of passion, it was the result of a dangerous obsession that had been building for months. Fontana had developed what psychologists would later describe as an unhealthy fixation on Carol. He had misinterpreted their neighborly interactions as signs of romantic interest, had convinced himself that they were in a relationship, and had then become increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as Carol's rejection of his feelings. The fact that Carol worked in the adult entertainment industry had become a particular source of obsession for Fontana. He told investigators that he felt Carol was uninhibited, and that her work made him feel used. This victim-blaming narrative would later become a controversial element of the legal proceedings, as it suggested that Fontana believed Carol's profession somehow justified his actions. Perhaps most tragically, investigators learned that Carol had been planning to leave Rescaldina with her son, moving to Verona to start a new life. This decision, which represented hope and new beginnings for Carol, had apparently triggered Fontana's violent response. In his distorted view of reality, Carol's plan to move away represented a final rejection of the relationship that existed only in his imagination. The legal case against Davide Fontana began in earnest following his confession. He was charged with willful murder, destruction of a corpse, and concealment of a crime, charges that carried the possibility of life imprisonment under Italian law. The case would wind through the Italian court system for more than 2 years, with each hearing revealing new details about the horrific crime. Initially, Fontana's legal team pursued a strategy that sought to avoid a life sentence by requesting an abbreviated trial procedure. This legal maneuver, while procedurally appropriate, was seen by many as an attempt to minimize the severity of the crime and avoid the full consequences of his actions. The prosecution, however, was determined to seek the maximum penalty. They argued that Fontana's crime was not only brutal but also premeditated, that his actions following the murder showed a calculated attempt to evade justice, and that the victim-blaming elements of his confession demonstrated a lack of remorse that warranted the harshest possible sentence. During the trial proceedings, disturbing details about Fontana's mindset emerged. The court heard testimony about his obsession with Carol, his inability to accept that their relationship existed only in his imagination, and his belief that her work in the adult entertainment industry somehow justified his actions. These revelations painted a picture of a man whose dangerous delusions had led to unthinkable violence. Throughout the legal proceedings, efforts were made to ensure that Carol's voice wasn't lost in the focus on her killer. Friends and family members testified about the woman they had known, the loving mother, the adventurous traveler, the person who had made difficult choices during a challenging time but had never deserved the fate that befell her. Carol's father became a particularly powerful advocate for justice, speaking out against not only Fontana's actions but also the legal system's handling of the case. When Fontana was admitted to a restorative justice program in September 2023, Carol's father expressed his shock and disgust, arguing that such programs were inappropriate for someone who had committed such a heinous crime. The restorative justice admission became a source of controversy, with many questioning whether someone who had murdered and dismembered another person should be eligible for programs designed to help offenders reintegrate into society. For Carol's family, it represented another injustice in a case that had already caused them unimaginable pain. In July 2023, the first court to hear Fontana's case delivered its verdict. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, the court sentenced Fontana to 30 years in prison rather than life imprisonment. The reasoning behind this decision was controversial, with the court apparently accepting arguments that portrayed Carol as somehow contributing to her own death through her work and lifestyle. The 30-year sentence was seen by many as inadequate given the premeditated nature of the crime and the additional charges of dismemberment and concealment. Victim advocacy groups expressed outrage at the verdict, arguing that it reflected outdated attitudes about women's autonomy and victim blaming that had no place in modern criminal justice. For Carol's family, the sentence represented a double injustice, first the loss of their daughter and mother, and then a legal system that seemed to devalue her life because of her profession. The message seemed to be that Carol's work in the adult entertainment industry made her somehow less worthy of justice, a notion that her supporters found deeply troubling. Fortunately, the Italian legal system provides for appeals, and prosecutors were not satisfied with the initial 30-year sentence. They appealed the verdict, arguing that the court had failed to properly consider the severity of the crime and the lack of genuine remorse shown by Fontana. The appeal process took nearly a year, during which time Carol's family continued to advocate for proper justice. They argued that the original sentence sent a dangerous message about how society values women's lives, particularly those of women who work in industries that some consider morally objectionable. On February 21, 2024, the Milan Court of Assizes of Appeal delivered its verdict. In a decision that marked a significant correction to the original sentence, the court sentenced Davide Fontana to life imprisonment. The appeals court found that the original sentence had been insufficient given the calculated nature of the crime and the additional charges of dismemberment and concealment. The life sentence represented not just justice for Carol Maltesi, but also a statement about the value of all women's lives regardless of their profession or lifestyle choices. It sent a clear message that victim blaming has no place in criminal justice and that those who commit such heinous crimes must face the full consequences of their actions. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Carol's story is the impact on her 6-year-old son, who lost his mother in the most violent way imaginable. The boy, who had been the center of Carol's world, was left orphaned by Fontana's actions, facing a future without the woman who had loved him more than life itself. During the final court proceedings, Fontana reportedly apologized to the child, acknowledging the pain he had caused. But words, however sincere, cannot restore a mother to her child or undo the trauma of such a loss. The boy, now older but still carrying the weight of his mother's violent death, faces a lifetime of living with the knowledge of how his mother died. Carol's family and friends have worked to ensure that the boy is cared for and that his mother's memory is preserved in a way that honors her love for him rather than focusing on the circumstances of her death. They want him to remember Carol as the adventurous, loving mother who dreamed of showing him the world, not as the victim of a neighbor's violent obsession. The murder of Carol Maltese raises important questions about society's attitudes toward women, particularly women who work in industries that challenge conventional moral boundaries. The initial court's decision to sentence Fontana to 30 years rather than life imprisonment suggested that some still view a woman's profession as relevant to the justice she deserves after being murdered. The case also highlights the dangers faced by women who work in adult entertainment, who may be particularly vulnerable to the kind of obsessive behavior that led to Carol's death. The isolation of such work, the stigma attached to it, and the way it can attract dangerous individuals all contribute to increased risks that society must acknowledge and address. Furthermore, Carol's story demonstrates how quickly a normal life can be destroyed by someone else's delusions. She was simply a neighbor to Fontana, someone who lived in the same building and occasionally crossed paths with him. The fact that he was able to construct an elaborate fantasy about their relationship and then punish her for failing to live up to it shows how dangerous obsessive behavior can be, particularly when it goes unrecognized and untreated. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember Carol Maltese not as a victim defined by her death, but as a person who lived a full life before it was cut short. She was a mother who adored her son, a traveler who had seen 26 countries and dreamed of seeing more, and a woman who made difficult choices during challenging times while maintaining her dignity and independence. Carol's story serves as a reminder that every victim of violence was once a person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Her death was not just a crime statistic or a legal case, it was the end of a life that had meaning and value far beyond the circumstances of how it ended. The fact that justice was ultimately served, that Fontana received a life sentence for his crimes, provides some measure of closure for Carol's family and friends. But it cannot restore what was lost or undo the pain that continues to ripple through the lives of those who knew and loved her. Today, Davide Fontana sits in an Italian prison, serving a life sentence for the murder of Carol Maltese. The man who once appeared to be a respectable bank employee, who lived an ordinary life in a quiet suburb, has been revealed as someone capable of unimaginable violence and calculation. His attempts to minimize his crime, to blame Carol for her own death, and to avoid the full consequences of his actions have all failed. The Italian legal system, after initially stumbling, ultimately delivered justice that reflects the true severity of his crime. But justice, while important, cannot bring back the young woman who dreamed of traveling the world with her son, who worked hard to provide for her family, and who trusted a neighbor enough to allow him into her home. Carol Maltese's story ends not with redemption or resolution, but with the simple acknowledgement that her life had value and that her death was a tragedy that should never have occurred. In the quiet suburb of Rescaldina, where Carol once lived and died, life continues. New neighbors move into the building where she once lived, unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there. But for those who knew Carol, who loved her, and who continue to mourn her loss, her memory lives on, not as a victim of violence, but as a person whose life mattered and whose death demands that we never forget the human cost of unchecked obsession and violence. The story of Carol Maltese serves as both a warning and a remembrance, a warning about the dangers that can lurk behind ordinary facades, and a remembrance of a life that was cut short but not forgotten. In telling her story, we honor not just her memory, but the memory of all those whose lives have been stolen by violence, and we commit ourselves to creating a world where such tragedies become increasingly rare. As we close this chapter on a story that should never have been written, we're reminded that true crime isn't just about the criminals, it's about the victims, their families, and the communities that must pick up the pieces and continue living in the wake of unthinkable loss. Carol Maltese's story is now part of that larger narrative, a reminder that behind every headline about violence is a real person whose life had meaning and whose death leaves a void that can never be filled. This has been the story of Carol Maltese, a young woman whose life was cut short by a neighbor's obsession, but whose memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. May she rest in peace, and may justice continue to be served in cases like hers around the world. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. On a cold January morning in 2007, the campus of North Carolina Central University should have been buzzing with the familiar sounds of students returning from winter break. Instead, the air was filled with police sirens and the hushed whispers of a community trying to comprehend an unthinkable tragedy. It was January 4, 2007, when a maintenance worker at the campus crossing apartments in Durham, North Carolina, made a discovery that would haunt him forever. As he walked along the sidewalk during his routine morning rounds, he noticed something at the bottom of the apartment complex stairwell that made his blood run cold. There, sprawled on the concrete, was the body of a young woman. Her belongings were scattered around her, a purse, keys, personal items that told the story of a life abruptly ended. The woman had been shot once in the back of the head, and the force of the impact had sent her tumbling down the stairs where she now lay motionless. The victim was soon identified as Danita Monique Smith, a 25-year-old graduate student who had been working toward her master's degree. She was known to her friends and family as a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Danita had dreams, plans, and most importantly, she had love in her life, or so she thought. Danita Smith appeared to have everything going for her. She was intelligent, beautiful, and deeply committed to her studies. Those who knew her described her as someone who lit up a room when she entered it. She had a warm smile and an infectious laugh that could lift anyone's spirits. More than her academic achievements, Danita was in love. She was engaged to Jameer Stroud, a police officer from Greensboro who seemed to be everything she could want in a partner. He was handsome, had a stable career, and appeared to adore her. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect couple, two young people building a life together, planning their future, discussing marriage and the dreams they would share. But beneath this picture-perfect surface, there were secrets. Dark secrets that Danita had no idea existed. Secrets that would ultimately cost her everything. While Danita was planning her future with Jameer, believing she had found her soulmate, Jameer was living a double life. For months, he had been involved in a secret affair with another woman, Shannon Crawley, a 911 dispatcher from Greensboro. Shannon was a single mother who worked the night shift, taking emergency calls and coordinating police responses. She was intelligent, attractive, and had become completely infatuated with Jameer. What had started as a workplace friendship had evolved into something much more dangerous. The affair between Jameer and Shannon was intense and complicated. They would meet in secret, steal moments together when Jameer was supposed to be working or when he told Danita he was busy with other commitments. Shannon became so deeply invested in this relationship that she began to see Jameer as her future, despite the fact that he was engaged to another woman. During their affair, Shannon became pregnant. This should have been a moment of truth, a time when decisions about the future would need to be made. Instead, Shannon had an abortion, and according to Jameer's later testimony, this event marked the beginning of the end of their physical relationship. He began to pull away, perhaps feeling guilty about what he was doing to both women in his life. But Shannon couldn't let go. She had invested too much of herself in this relationship, had allowed herself to believe that Jameer would eventually choose her over Danita. When he began to distance himself, her feelings of love began to transform into something much darker, obsession, jealousy, and ultimately, rage. As 2006 turned into 2007, Shannon's behavior became increasingly erratic. She couldn't accept that Jameer was choosing Danita over her. She began to follow him, to watch his movements, to try to insert herself into his life in any way she could. She would drive by his house, call him at work, and send messages that became increasingly desperate. But Shannon's obsession wasn't just focused on Jermier. She began to turn her attention to Danita, the woman she saw as the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. Shannon began to research Danita, learning about her routines, her schedule, where she lived, and where she went to school. The more Shannon learned about Danita, the more her resentment grew. Here was this woman who had everything Shannon wanted: Jermier's love, his commitment, his future. Danita was younger, successful in her own right, and most importantly, she was the one wearing Jermier's engagement ring. Shannon began to drive to Durham, to the campus crossing apartments where Danita lived. She would sit in her car and watch, learning Danita's patterns, her schedule, when she came and went. This wasn't casual curiosity, this was methodical surveillance, the kind of behavior that spoke to a mind that was planning something terrible. Meanwhile, Danita went about her life completely unaware that she was being watched. She had no idea that her fiancé had been unfaithful, and she certainly had no idea that there was a woman out there who saw her as an enemy. Danita continued with her studies, made plans for her future with Jermier, and lived her life with the innocence of someone who trusted completely. By late 2006 and early 2007, Shannon had moved beyond simple stalking. She had begun to formulate a plan that was as calculated as it was deadly. She obtained a gun, a decision that spoke to the dark turn her obsession had taken. This wasn't about confrontation or even about trying to win Jermier back, this was about elimination. Shannon's plan was methodical. She knew Danita's schedule, knew when she would be coming and going from her apartment. She had observed the layout of the campus crossing complex, noting the stairwell that led from the upper floors to the parking area below. She had studied the area enough to know when it would be most isolated, when she would be least likely to be seen. The most chilling aspect of Shannon's plan was how normal she appeared to everyone around her. She continued to work her shifts as a 911 dispatcher, taking calls from people in crisis, coordinating emergency responses, playing the role of someone who helped people in their darkest moments. Nobody at work suspected that she was planning a murder. She also continued to maintain contact with Jermier, though their relationship had become strained. He had told her multiple times that he was committed to Danita, that their affair was over, but Shannon refused to accept this reality. In her mind, if Danita were no longer in the picture, Jermier would have no choice but to be with her. January 4, 2007, dawned cold and gray in Durham. Danita woke up that morning with no idea that it would be her last day on Earth. She went through her normal routine, perhaps checking her phone for messages from Jermier, getting ready for whatever plans she had that day, thinking about her classes and her future. Shannon, meanwhile, was preparing for murder. She had made the decision that this would be the day she would act on the plan she had been developing for weeks. She loaded her gun, got in her car, and began the drive from Greensboro to Durham, a journey that would take her about an hour and a half. During that drive, Shannon had plenty of time to think about what she was about to do. She could have turned around at any point, could have chosen a different path, could have sought help for the obsession that was consuming her. Instead, she continued toward Durham, toward Danita, toward a moment that would destroy multiple lives forever. When Shannon arrived at the campus crossing apartments, she positioned herself where she could watch and wait. She knew Danita's routines well enough to predict when she would be leaving her apartment. All Shannon had to do was wait for the right moment. The details of what happened next are both simple and horrific. As Danita was walking down the stairwell of her apartment complex, Shannon approached from behind. Danita may have heard footsteps, may have even turned around to see who was there, but she would have had no idea who Shannon was or why this stranger was following her. In a moment that lasted only seconds but would echo through time, Shannon raised her gun and fired once into the back of Danita's head. The shot was fatal instantly. The force of the bullet sent Danita tumbling down the stairs, her body coming to rest at the bottom of the stairwell, her belongings scattered around her. Shannon didn't stay to see the aftermath of what she had done. She fled the scene immediately, leaving behind a young woman whose only crime had been loving a man who was living a lie. Danita died never knowing about Jameer's affair, never knowing that she had been targeted by a woman consumed with jealousy and obsession. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the apartment complex, but in a world where people often mistake such sounds for cars backfiring or construction noise, it took precious time for anyone to realize what had actually happened. By the time the maintenance worker discovered Danita's body, Shannon was long gone, already beginning the process of constructing the lies that she hoped would save her from the consequences of her actions. When police arrived at the Campus Crossing apartments, they found a scene that told a clear story of violence. Danita's body lay at the bottom of the stairwell, a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. Her purse and belongings were scattered around her, but importantly, nothing appeared to have been taken. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, this was an execution. The investigators began the painstaking process of gathering evidence. They photographed the scene, collected shell casings, and began interviewing residents of the apartment complex. They also began the difficult task of notifying Danita's family and friends, including her fiancé Jameer. When police contacted Jameer to inform him of Danita's death, his reaction appeared to be one of genuine shock and grief. He rushed to Durham to be with investigators and to begin the process of identifying who might have wanted to harm the woman he was planning to marry. In those first crucial hours, Jameer appeared to be nothing more than a grieving fiancé trying to understand how his world had been turned upside down. But as investigators began to dig deeper into Danita's life, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to kill her, they discovered something that changed everything. Danita, by all accounts, had no enemies. She was well-liked, focused on her studies, and had no known conflicts with anyone. She wasn't involved in drugs, didn't have money problems, and had no history of domestic violence. The lack of obvious suspects forced investigators to look more closely at the people in Danita's inner circle, and that's when they began to uncover the secrets that Jameer had been hiding. It didn't take long for investigators to discover that Jameer had been living a double life. Phone records, witness statements, and Jameer's own eventual admissions revealed the truth about his relationship with Shannon Crawley. Suddenly, investigators had a new suspect, a woman who had motive, means, and opportunity to kill Danita. When confronted with evidence of the affair, Jameer initially tried to downplay its significance, but eventually, he was forced to admit the truth. He had been involved with Shannon for months, and yes, she had become increasingly obsessive and difficult to manage as he had tried to end their relationship. Jameer described Shannon as someone who couldn't accept that their affair was over. He told investigators about her constant phone calls, her unexpected visits, and her refusal to accept that he was committed to Danita. He also revealed that Shannon had been asking questions about Danita, wanting to know details about her life, her schedule, and where she lived. Most damning of all, Jameer admitted that Shannon had been driving to Durham regularly, often without any clear purpose other than to be in the same area as Danita. This pattern of behavior painted a picture of a woman who was not just heartbroken, but who was actively stalking her romantic rival. With this new information, investigators shifted their focus to Shannon Crawley. They began gathering evidence of her whereabouts on January 4th, analyzing her phone records, and looking for any physical evidence that might connect her to the crime scene. The investigation revealed that Shannon had indeed been in Durham on the morning of Danita's murder. Cell phone records showed her phone connecting to towers in the area around the time of the shooting. Investigators also discovered that Shannon had been researching Danita online, looking up information about her and the Campus Crossing apartments. But perhaps most importantly, investigators found witnesses who had seen Shannon in the area on the morning of the murder. A maintenance worker at the apartment complex remembered seeing a woman matching Shannon's description, a tall black woman with a ponytail, near the scene around the time of the shooting. 5 days after Danita's murder, on January 9, 2007, police arrested Shannon Crawley at her home in Greensboro. She was charged with first-degree murder, and suddenly the case that had begun with a grieving fiancé and a seemingly random killing had transformed into a story of obsession, jealousy, and calculated murder. When Shannon was arrested, she immediately began constructing a defense that would become the centerpiece of her strategy at trial. Rather than deny being in Durham on the morning of the murder, she admitted to being there but claimed that she was not the one who had pulled the trigger. Instead, Shannon pointed the finger at Jermier. She claimed that he had been with her that morning, that he had been the one who had actually killed Danita, and that she had been forced to go along with his plan out of fear for her own life and the lives of her children. According to Shannon's version of events, Jermier had been stalking her, threatening her, and had convinced her to drive to Durham on the morning of January 4th. She claimed that when they arrived at the Campus Crossing apartments, Jermier had hidden in the back of her SUV and that she had been ordered to wait while he went to confront Danita. Shannon testified that she had heard the gunshot and had seen Jermier return to the vehicle, but that she had been too frightened to do anything about it. She painted herself as another victim of Jermier's violence, a woman who had been manipulated and threatened into participating in a crime she never wanted to commit. To support her claims, Shannon even produced what she claimed was a recorded confession from Jermier, a conversation where he allegedly admitted to killing Danita. This tape became a crucial piece of evidence in her defense, though its authenticity and context would become major points of contention during the trial. Shannon's trial began in February 2010, more than 3 years after Danita's murder. The case had attracted significant media attention, both because of the shocking nature of the crime and because of the complex web of relationships that had led to it. The prosecution, led by Durham County Chief Assistant District Attorney David Sox, painted a picture of Shannon as a woman consumed by jealousy and obsession. They argued that she had systematically stalked Danita, learned her routines, and then executed a carefully planned murder in order to eliminate her romantic rival. The prosecution presented evidence of Shannon's repeated trips to Durham, her research into Danita's life, and witness testimony placing her at the scene of the crime. They also challenged the authenticity of the recorded confession she claimed to have obtained from Jermier, arguing that it was either fabricated or taken out of context. Most importantly, the prosecution asked the jury to consider the facts rather than Shannon's elaborate story. They pointed out that Shannon had means, motive, and opportunity to commit the murder, and that her claims about Jermier's involvement were unsupported by physical evidence. The defense, meanwhile, stuck to Shannon's story that Jermier was the real killer. They argued that he had manipulated and threatened Shannon, and that she had been forced to participate in the crime against her will. They presented the recorded confession as evidence of Jermier's guilt and tried to paint Shannon as another victim of his violence. The defense also attempted to portray Shannon as a devoted mother who would never have committed such a crime on her own. They argued that she had been psychologically manipulated by Jermier and that her actions on January 4th were the result of coercion rather than premeditation. After hearing weeks of testimony and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, the jury retired to deliberate Shannon's fate. They had to decide whether to believe Shannon's claims that Jermier was the real killer, or whether to accept the prosecution's argument that she was a jealous woman who had committed a carefully planned murder. The jury deliberated for about 7 hours over the course of 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict was clear. They found Shannon Crawley guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Danita Smith. The jury had rejected Shannon's claims about Jermier's involvement, instead concluding that she had been the one who had pulled the trigger on that cold January morning. They had looked at the evidence and determined that Shannon's story was simply not credible, that her claims about coercion and manipulation were lies designed to escape responsibility for her actions. Judge Ronald Stevens immediately sentenced Shannon to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the calculated nature of Shannon's actions. She had taken the life of an innocent young woman out of jealousy and obsession, and the justice system had held her accountable for that choice. The conviction of Shannon Crawley brought some measure of justice for Danita's family and friends, but it could never bring back the bright young woman whose life had been cut short. Danita's mother, Sharon Smith, spoke at the sentencing, expressing her pain and the void that Shannon's actions had created in her life. "Because of what Shannon did, there is a void," Sharon Smith said. "You took her away from me." She also spoke about the possibility of forgiveness, saying, "Someday, I may forgive you, but I don't right now." For Jermier, the trial and conviction brought its own form of justice, but also a lifetime of guilt and regret. While he had not been the one who pulled the trigger, his affair with Shannon had set in motion the events that led to Danita's death. He had betrayed the woman he claimed to love, and that betrayal had cost Danita her life. The case also highlighted the dangers of obsession and the tragic consequences that can result when someone refuses to accept the end of a relationship. Shannon's inability to let go of Jermier, her escalating stalking behavior, and her ultimate decision to eliminate her perceived rival had destroyed multiple lives and families. The murder of Danita Smith serves as a tragic reminder of how quickly love can turn to obsession, and how obsession can lead to violence. Shannon Crawley's actions were not the result of a moment of passion or a sudden loss of control, they were the product of weeks and months of planning, stalking, and escalating behavior. The case also demonstrates the importance of taking stalking and threatening behavior seriously. Shannon's obsession with Jermier and her surveillance of Danita were warning signs that, if recognized and acted upon, might have prevented a tragedy. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the need to look beyond the obvious suspects and to investigate all of the relationships and connections in a victim's life. Danita appeared to have no enemies, but the secret affair between her fiancé and another woman had created a deadly triangle that she never even knew existed. Shannon Crawley remains in prison today, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. She has maintained her innocence in some interviews and appeals, continuing to claim that Jermier was the real killer and that she was coerced into participating in the crime. However, her appeals have been unsuccessful, and the conviction has stood. The evidence presented at trial convinced a jury of her guilt, and subsequent legal reviews have upheld that verdict. Shannon will likely spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for the choice she made on that cold January morning in 2007. The case of Shannon Crawley has been featured in numerous true crime television shows and documentaries, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the tragic consequences of refusing to accept the end of a relationship. While Shannon's story is one of obsession and violence, it's important to remember that the real tragedy here is the loss of Danita Smith. She was a young woman with dreams, goals, and a bright future ahead of her. She was working toward her master's degree, planning her wedding, and building a life with someone she loved and trusted. Danita's death was not just a statistic or a case study, it was the ending of a life full of potential. She had friends who loved her, a family who cherished her, and professors who believed in her abilities. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's hope for the future. The fact that Danita died never knowing about her fiancé's betrayal, never knowing that she was in danger, makes her murder all the more tragic. She lived her final days in innocence, trusting in the love of someone who was deceiving her, unaware that her very existence was seen as a threat by a woman she had never met. As we reflect on this case, it's clear that the truth is often more complex than it initially appears. What seemed like a random act of violence against a graduate student turned out to be a carefully planned murder rooted in jealousy, obsession, and betrayal. The case also reveals the ripple effects of deception and infidelity. Jermier's affair with Shannon didn't just hurt Danita, it created a situation that ultimately led to her death. His decision to live a double life had consequences he never could have imagined, consequences that cost an innocent woman her life. Shannon's actions, meanwhile, serve as a stark reminder of how obsession can consume a person's judgment and moral compass. Her inability to accept rejection, her escalating stalking behavior, and her ultimate decision to commit murder show how dangerous it can be when someone refuses to let go of a relationship that has ended. The murder of Danita Smith is a story with no real winners, only victims, consequences, and the tragic waste of a young life that held so much promise. It's a case that reminds us to take threatening behavior seriously, to be honest in our relationships, and to remember that behind every crime statistic is a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Danita Smith not as a victim of a crime, but as a young woman who lived, loved, and dreamed of a future that was stolen from her far too soon. Her story deserves to be told, her life deserves to be remembered, and her death serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of treating each other with honesty, respect, and kindness. The case of Shannon Crawley and the murder of Danita Smith is now closed, but the lessons it teaches us about love, obsession, and the consequences of our actions will continue to resonate for years to come. In the end, justice was served, but at a cost that was far too high, the life of an innocent young woman who deserved so much better than the fate that befell her on that cold January morning in 2007. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the glittering metropolis of Hong Kong, where towering skyscrapers pierce the clouds and luxury knows no bounds, lived a woman whose life seemed like a fairy tale. Abby Choi Tin Fung was 28 years old, a mother of 4, and had built herself into something of a social media sensation. Her Instagram account gleamed with pictures of designer handbags, exotic vacations, and the kind of lifestyle that most people only dream about. But beneath the surface of this carefully curated perfection, a web of relationships, money, and resentment was slowly tightening around her. February 2023 began like any other month in Abby's world. She moved through Hong Kong's elite social circles with the confidence of someone who had found her place among the city's wealthy and influential. Her followers watched her every move, admiring her fashion choices, her travels, and what appeared to be an enviable life. But Abby's story wasn't just about wealth and glamour. It was about the complicated nature of human relationships, the weight of financial obligations, and how quickly paradise can turn into something far more sinister. Abby's life had been shaped by 2 significant relationships. Her first marriage, back in 2012, was to a man named Alex Kwong Kong Chi. This union produced 2 children and seemed, from the outside, to be a typical young couple starting their lives together. But like many relationships that begin with promise, theirs gradually soured. By 2016, after 4 years of marriage, Abby and Alex had divorced. The end of their marriage, however, didn't mean the end of their connection. They shared custody of their children, and Alex's family remained deeply involved in Abby's life. After her divorce, Abby found love again with Chris Tam Chuk Kwan, a man whose family background was steeped in wealth and influence. Chris's father was a successful businessman, and this new relationship lifted Abby even further into Hong Kong's upper echelons. With Chris, she had 2 more children, creating a blended family that required careful navigation between her past and present. The relationship with Chris wasn't just romantic, it was also financial. The couple's combined wealth was estimated at around 300 million Hong Kong dollars, a fortune that would later become central to the tragic events that followed. But wealth, as many have learned, can be both a blessing and a curse. For Abby, her financial success created expectations and dependencies that extended far beyond her immediate family. Alex Kwong and his family had become accustomed to a certain standard of living, partly supported by Abby's generosity and partly by the complex financial arrangements that often accompany wealthy divorces. As time passed, these arrangements became a source of increasing tension. The relationship between Abby and her ex-husband's family was complicated in ways that many people might find difficult to understand. In traditional Chinese culture, family connections often extend far beyond the nuclear family, creating networks of obligation and expectation that can last for generations. Even after her divorce from Alex, Abby continued to provide financial support to his family, including help with housing and other expenses. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but by early 2023, signs of strain were becoming apparent. According to court documents that would later emerge, there were disputes over property, specifically involving luxury apartments that Abby had been involved in purchasing. The details of these financial disagreements were complex, involving questions of ownership, responsibility for mortgage payments, and the division of assets that had been acquired during and after the marriage. Jenny Lee Sway-hyung, Alex's mother and Abby's former mother-in-law, would later describe the relationship between Abby, Alex, and Chris as chaotic. This characterization suggests that the neat divisions we might expect in such situations simply didn't exist. Instead, there was an ongoing entanglement of financial, emotional, and familial obligations that created stress for everyone involved. The pressure of maintaining multiple relationships while managing substantial wealth was taking its toll on Abby. Friends who knew her during this period would later describe her as someone who was generous to a fault, always willing to help others but perhaps not always careful about the boundaries she set. This generosity, while admirable, may have contributed to the very problems that would eventually lead to her death. February 21, 2023, began as what appeared to be a normal day in Abby's life. She went about her usual routines, caring for her children, managing her social media presence, and handling the various business and personal matters that filled her days. Those who saw her during this time reported nothing unusual about her behavior or demeanor. What they didn't know was that behind the scenes, tensions had been building to a breaking point. The property disputes that had been simmering for months were reaching a critical stage. According to investigators, Alex Kwong and his family had become increasingly concerned about their financial security, particularly regarding the luxury apartment arrangements that Abby had been supporting. The evening of February 21 was the last time Abby was seen alive by anyone outside of her killers. She had arrangements to pick up her children, as she did regularly as part of her co-parenting schedule with Alex. It was a routine that she had followed countless times before, driving to the designated meeting point where the children would be transferred to her care. But this time, something was different. This time, the meeting had been orchestrated not for the innocent purpose of child custody exchange, but as a trap. The exact details of how Abby was lured to her death remain part of the ongoing legal proceedings, but investigators believe that her ex-husband's family used her love for her children as the bait to draw her into a situation from which she would never escape. When Abby failed to return home on the evening of February 21, her current husband Chris became concerned. In a household with 4 children and busy schedules, it wasn't unusual for someone to be slightly late, but as the hours passed, Chris's concern grew into alarm. Abby was meticulous about her schedule, particularly when it came to her children, and her failure to communicate was completely out of character. The following morning, February 22, Chris contacted the police to report his wife missing. The Hong Kong police force, accustomed to dealing with missing persons cases in a city of over 7 million people, began their standard procedures. They interviewed family members, checked with friends, and began trying to trace Abby's movements from the previous day. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who had simply vanished. Her car was found abandoned, her phone was going straight to voicemail, and none of her usual haunts had seen her. For someone with as high a profile as Abby, this complete disappearance was particularly alarming. She was the type of person who was regularly seen at social events, photographed at restaurants, and active on social media. Her sudden absence from all of these spaces created a void that was immediately noticeable. The investigation began to focus on the last known sighting of Abby, which led police to examine her relationship with her ex-husband's family. As they dug deeper, they uncovered the financial disputes that had been ongoing and began to consider the possibility that Abby's disappearance might not be a random crime or accident, but something much more disturbing. 3 days after Abby was reported missing, on February 24, 2023, police made a discovery that would shock Hong Kong and capture international attention. In a small village called Lung Mei Tsuen, in the Tai Po district of Hong Kong, investigators found evidence that would confirm their worst fears about what had happened to Abby Choi. The location was a ground-floor apartment in a village house, a type of low-rise residential building common in Hong Kong's more rural areas. This particular apartment had been rented by members of Alex Kwong's family, and when police entered, they found a scene that would haunt even experienced investigators. Parts of Abby's dismembered body were discovered in a refrigerator, stored as if they were nothing more than pieces of meat. The methodical nature of the dismemberment suggested planning and premeditation rather than a crime of passion. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some of her remains had been cooked in a large pot, an act that spoke to a level of depravity that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. The apartment had been turned into a makeshift butcher shop and kitchen, with tools and equipment that suggested the perpetrators had spent considerable time disposing of Abby's body. The clinical nature of the scene indicated that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but rather a carefully planned execution followed by an attempt to completely eliminate all traces of the victim. The discovery of Abby's remains transformed the missing person case into one of the most high-profile murder investigations in Hong Kong's recent history. The city, which prides itself on being one of the safest in the world, was shaken by the brutal nature of the crime. The fact that it involved a wealthy socialite and appeared to be the result of a family dispute made it even more disturbing to the public. 2 days after the initial discovery, on February 26, investigators made another grim finding. While continuing to search the apartment, they discovered a large pot containing what appeared to be soup. Upon closer examination, they found that the soup contained Abby's severed head and several of her ribs. The realization that her killers had not only dismembered her body but had also cooked parts of it added another layer of horror to an already shocking crime. This discovery provided investigators with crucial evidence, but it also raised disturbing questions about the mental state of the perpetrators. The act of cooking human remains suggested a level of detachment from reality that went beyond typical criminal behavior. It indicated that the killers had not only planned her death but had also spent considerable time disposing of her body in the most degrading way possible. The investigation team, led by some of Hong Kong's most experienced homicide detectives, began to piece together the timeline of Abby's final days. They examined phone records, security camera footage, and financial transactions to build a comprehensive picture of what had led to her death. What emerged was a story of family dysfunction, financial desperation, and ultimately, cold-blooded murder. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this wasn't a random crime but rather an intimate family matter that had escalated to murder. On February 26, police arrested several members of Alex Kwong's family in connection with Abby's death. The arrest sent shockwaves through Hong Kong's social media community and the broader public, as details of the case began to emerge. Alex Kwong Kong-chi, Abby's ex-husband, was charged with her murder. But he wasn't alone. His father, Kwong Kao, and his brother, Anthony Kwong, were also arrested and charged with murder. The involvement of multiple family members suggested that this was a conspiracy that had been planned and executed by the entire family unit. Perhaps most disturbing was the arrest of Jenny Lee Sui-hyung, Alex's mother and Abby's former mother-in-law. While she wasn't charged with murder, she was accused of perverting the course of justice, suggesting that she had helped cover up the crime or had knowledge of it that she failed to report to authorities. The arrests revealed the extent to which the Kwong family had been involved in planning and executing Abby's murder. This wasn't a case of one person snapping under pressure, but rather a coordinated effort involving multiple family members who had come together to eliminate someone they viewed as a threat to their financial security. While police were making arrests and processing the crime scene, Alex Kwong was attempting to flee Hong Kong. Investigators discovered that he had tried to leave the city using a speedboat, heading toward Macau in what appeared to be a carefully planned escape route. The fact that he had arranged this escape suggests that he knew his crime would be discovered and that he had prepared for the possibility of fleeing the jurisdiction. Alex's escape attempt was facilitated by at least 2 accomplices who would later be charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Lam Shun, a yacht rental agent, was accused of organizing the escape attempt for a payment of 300,000 Hong Kong dollars. Irene Pun Hauyin, who was described as unemployed, was alleged to have helped arrange the logistics of the escape. The escape attempt was ultimately unsuccessful. Alex was arrested at the Tung Chung Development Pier while attempting to board a boat that would take him to Macau. His capture marked the end of a brief but intense manhunt that had captured public attention throughout Hong Kong. The fact that Alex had prepared an escape route and had accomplices ready to help him flee suggested that the murder of Abby had been planned well in advance. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but rather a calculated crime that had been months in the making. The legal proceedings that followed Abby's murder were complex and drawn out, reflecting both the serious nature of the charges and the complicated family dynamics that had led to the crime. The case involved multiple defendants, each facing different charges, and required extensive investigation and testimony from numerous witnesses. The prosecution's case was built around the argument that the Kwong family had murdered Abby because of ongoing financial disputes, particularly regarding property that they believed she should continue to support. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to shift blame between family members and questioned the extent of each person's involvement in the actual murder. One of the most difficult aspects of the trial was the testimony regarding the family relationships that had led to the crime. Former mother-in-law Jenny Lee's testimony revealed the complex dynamics that had existed between Abby, her ex-husband, and his family. Her description of the relationship as chaotic provided insight into the dysfunction that had ultimately led to murder. The trial also revealed details about Abby's financial situation and the extent to which she had been supporting her ex-husband's family. Evidence was presented showing that she had been paying for housing, living expenses, and other costs for the Kwong family, creating a dependency that may have contributed to the motive for her murder. As the legal proceedings continued into 2024 and 2025, the case remained in the public eye as one of Hong Kong's most shocking crimes. The brutality of the murder, combined with the family dynamics that had led to it, made it a case that continued to generate discussion and analysis long after the initial arrests. The conviction of the accomplices who had helped Alex attempt to flee Hong Kong provided some closure, but the main murder trial continued as the defendants and their lawyers fought the charges. The complexity of the case, involving multiple defendants and extensive evidence, meant that the legal process would likely continue for years. For Hong Kong society, the case served as a stark reminder that wealth and privilege could not protect someone from the most basic human dangers. Abby's murder highlighted issues of domestic violence, financial abuse, and the ways in which family relationships can become toxic and dangerous. The case also raised questions about the support systems available to women who find themselves in difficult financial and family situations. While Abby had appeared to have every advantage that money could buy, she had ultimately been vulnerable to the very people who should have been part of her support network. Abby Choi's murder left behind more than just a legal case. It left 4 children without their mother and a community grappling with the reality that such violence could occur in their seemingly safe city. The 300 million Hong Kong dollar fortune that Abby had accumulated was now tied up in legal proceedings that would likely take years to resolve, leaving her children's future uncertain. The case also sparked broader discussions about domestic violence and the warning signs that might have been missed. Friends and family members who had known Abby began to speak about subtle signs of stress and concern that she had exhibited in the months before her death, leading to questions about whether the tragedy might have been prevented. For the broader Hong Kong community, the case served as a wake-up call about the hidden violence that can exist within seemingly perfect families. The image of Abby's glamorous lifestyle, as presented on social media, stood in stark contrast to the reality of the financial pressures and family disputes that had ultimately led to her death. As we reflect on the story of Abby Choi, we're reminded that the most dangerous threats often come from those closest to us. Her murder wasn't the result of a random crime or a stranger's violence, but rather the culmination of family relationships that had turned toxic and deadly. The case highlights the particular vulnerabilities that can exist within wealthy families, where financial dependencies and expectations can create pressures that lead to violence. It also demonstrates how quickly situations can escalate when money, custody, and family honor become entangled in ways that create impossible tensions. Abby's story is ultimately a tragedy about the failure of human relationships and the deadly consequences that can result when financial disputes and family dysfunction intersect. Her death serves as a reminder that wealth and status provide no protection against the most basic human dangers, and that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest threat. As Hong Kong continues to process this tragedy and work through the legal proceedings that will determine justice for Abby Choi, her story remains a sobering reminder of how quickly a life that appears perfect from the outside can become a nightmare behind closed doors. The murder of Abby Choi shocked Hong Kong and the world, not just because of its brutality, but because of how it revealed the hidden dangers that can exist within families and the devastating consequences when financial disputes and personal relationships collide. Her story serves as a reminder that safety and security are never guaranteed, regardless of wealth or status, and that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we explore the case of the Phantom of Heilbronn, a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about forensic science and the reliability of DNA evidence. This is a tale that spans 16 years, crosses 3 countries, and involves over 40 crime scenes. It's the story of a killer who terrorized communities across Germany, Austria, and France, leaving behind a trail of DNA evidence that would ultimately lead investigators down a path they never could have imagined. Our story begins in 1993, in the quiet towns and cities scattered across Central Europe. Police departments in Germany, Austria, and France began noticing something peculiar appearing at their crime scenes, traces of DNA that didn't belong to any of their suspects, yet kept appearing with disturbing regularity. At first, these traces seemed insignificant. A few skin cells here, a touch of saliva there. But as months turned to years, and years stretched into decades, a pattern began to emerge that would both fascinate and terrify law enforcement officials across 3 nations. The DNA belonged to a woman. The same woman. Every single time. Picture the confusion in those early days. Detectives would arrive at completely unrelated crime scenes, a burglary in Bavaria, a break-in in Baden-Württemberg, a theft in Austria, only to discover that the same mysterious female had somehow been present at each location. Her genetic signature was as consistent as a fingerprint, yet she remained completely invisible to every witness, every security camera, every conventional method of detection. The crimes themselves were bewildering in their variety. This wasn't the typical pattern of a serial offender who sticks to one type of crime. No, this phantom seemed to be involved in everything from petty theft to the most serious of offenses. She would break into garden sheds and steal food and drink, apparently spending the night in these makeshift shelters. She would burglarize homes, leaving behind only the faintest trace of her presence. And then, inexplicably, that same DNA would appear at murder scenes. As the years passed, investigators began to realize they were dealing with something unprecedented. This wasn't just a prolific criminal, this was someone who seemed to move through the criminal underworld like a ghost, touching every type of crime imaginable while never once being seen or identified by any traditional means. The media, hungry for a story that captured the public's imagination, began calling her the Phantom of Heilbronn. The name stuck, and soon she became known throughout Europe as the Woman Without a Face. By the early 2000s, the Phantom had become a household name across Central Europe. Her DNA had been found at crime scenes spanning an incredible range of criminal activity. She had apparently been involved in armed robberies in France, where her genetic material was discovered on items that had been handled during the commission of these serious crimes. In Germany, her DNA appeared at burglary scenes where she seemed to favor breaking into small buildings and structures. Garden huts, storage sheds, even school buildings, nowhere seemed safe from her intrusion. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of her DNA on drug paraphernalia found in a schoolyard. The implications were chilling. Was this phantom not only a thief and burglar, but also someone involved in drug trafficking near children? The investigation files grew thicker with each passing month. Police departments across 3 countries began sharing information, creating a massive database of crimes all linked by the same mysterious genetic signature. The Phantom's criminal resume was staggering in its breadth. She had apparently been involved in car dealership robberies, residential burglaries, drug crimes, and theft operations spanning multiple countries and nearly a decade. But it was the murders that truly elevated the case to international attention. 6 homicides, spread across the years, all bearing the same DNA signature. Each crime scene told a story of violence and death, and at each one, investigators found traces of the same elusive woman. The Phantom's victims came from all walks of life. She didn't discriminate based on age, gender, or social status. Her crimes seemed random, almost chaotic, as if she were striking wherever opportunity presented itself. This randomness made her even more terrifying to the public and more frustrating to law enforcement. What made the case even more puzzling was the testimony of other criminals. When police arrested suspects for some of these crimes, particularly the car dealership robbery and the school break-in, those who were convicted adamantly denied the existence of any female accomplice. They insisted they had worked alone, that there was no woman involved in their crimes whatsoever. This created a paradox that investigators couldn't resolve. How could someone's DNA be present at a crime scene when the perpetrators themselves insisted she had never been there? Was she so skilled at remaining hidden that even her own criminal associates were unaware of her presence? Or was something else entirely going on? As the crimes continued to mount, European law enforcement agencies began to coordinate their efforts like never before. The case of the Phantom of Heilbronn had become a priority investigation spanning multiple countries, consuming thousands of man-hours and costing millions of euros. Profilers from across Europe were brought in to analyze the Phantom's behavior patterns. They studied her crimes, looking for psychological clues that might help predict her next move or reveal her identity. The profile that emerged was of a woman who was both extremely careful and surprisingly reckless. She could move through multiple countries without being detected, yet she consistently left behind genetic evidence of her presence. The investigation team developed theories about her background and motivations. Some believed she was part of an organized crime network, moving from country to country to avoid detection. Others thought she might be a transient, someone without a fixed address who survived by committing crimes of opportunity. Still others wondered if she might be involved in human trafficking or other large-scale criminal enterprises. A reward was established for information leading to her capture. The amount grew over the years as the crimes continued, eventually reaching 400,000 euros, an enormous sum that reflected just how desperately authorities wanted to bring this Phantom to justice. The reward was publicized across Europe, leading to thousands of tips and potential sightings, all of which ultimately led nowhere. The investigation became so desperate that authorities began consulting unconventional sources. They brought in diviners and fortune-tellers, hoping that somehow mystical insights might succeed where traditional police work had failed. The fact that serious law enforcement agencies were resorting to such methods spoke to the level of frustration and desperation that had gripped the investigation. Meanwhile, the Phantom's DNA continued to appear at crime scenes with disturbing regularity. By 2009, her genetic signature had been found at over 40 different locations across 3 countries. Each discovery reinforced the investigators' belief that they were dealing with an exceptionally active and dangerous criminal. The case had become something of an obsession for many of the investigators involved. They had devoted years of their careers to tracking down this elusive woman, and the fact that she remained completely invisible despite leaving behind so much genetic evidence was both professionally frustrating and personally maddening. April 25, 2007, marked a turning point in the Phantom of Heilbronn case. On that day, a crime was committed that would elevate the investigation to its highest priority level and ultimately lead to one of the most shocking revelations in forensic history. A 22-year-old police officer named Michelle Kieswetter was shot and killed in Heilbronn, Germany. She had been sitting in a police car with her partner when unknown assailants approached and opened fire. Officer Kieswetter was killed instantly, while her partner was severely wounded but survived the attack. The murder of a police officer sent shockwaves through the German law enforcement community. This was no longer just about burglaries and petty crimes. A member of their own family had been killed in cold blood. The investigation was given unlimited resources and the highest possible priority. When forensic investigators processed the crime scene, they made a discovery that both thrilled and terrified them. The DNA of the Phantom of Heilbronn was found on evidence related to the murder. After years of tracking this elusive criminal through relatively minor crimes, they now had concrete evidence linking her to the murder of a police officer. The investigation took on a new urgency. This was no longer just about solving a series of property crimes, they were now hunting the killer of one of their own. The Phantom had crossed a line that law enforcement agencies would never forgive or forget. Massive resources were devoted to the case. The investigation team was expanded, bringing in specialists from across Europe. The crime scene was processed and reprocessed, with investigators looking for any clue that might lead them to the Phantom's identity or whereabouts. The murder weapon was analyzed extensively. The Phantom's DNA was found on items that had been in contact with the weapon, providing investigators with what they believed was their strongest evidence yet. This wasn't just a case of DNA found on random objects at a crime scene, this was genetic evidence directly linked to the murder of a police officer. Public interest in the case reached fever pitch. The murder of Officer Kieswetter had captured the attention of the German public, and the fact that it was linked to the mysterious Phantom made it even more compelling. News coverage was extensive, with reporters and true crime enthusiasts following every development in the investigation. The Phantom had become more than just a criminal, she had become a symbol of law enforcement's frustration with modern crime. Here was someone who could apparently commit murder with impunity, leaving behind evidence of her presence while remaining completely invisible to every attempt at identification. As 2008 turned to 2009, investigators believed they were finally closing in on their target. The Phantom's DNA had now been found at more than 40 crime scenes, creating what they thought was an insurmountable web of evidence. Surely, with all of this genetic material, they would eventually be able to track her down. The investigation had consumed enormous resources. Over 16,000 man-hours had been devoted to the case, and the total cost had exceeded €2 million. Dozens of investigators across 3 countries had made the Phantom their primary focus, dedicating years of their careers to bringing her to justice. In laboratories across Europe, scientists were working around the clock to analyze and reanalyze the Phantom's DNA. They had constructed detailed genetic profiles, hoping to find clues about her ethnic background, her geographical origins, or any other information that might help narrow down her identity. The mitochondrial DNA analysis revealed characteristics most commonly found among people from Eastern Europe and neighboring Russia. This gave investigators a geographical focus for their search, and they began concentrating their efforts on communities with connections to these regions. But despite all of their efforts, the Phantom remained as elusive as ever. She continued to commit crimes, leaving behind her genetic calling card, while somehow managing to avoid every surveillance camera, every witness, and every conventional method of detection. The investigation team began to consider increasingly exotic theories. Perhaps she was using sophisticated disguises that made her unrecognizable. Maybe she had undergone plastic surgery to alter her appearance. Some investigators even wondered if she might be working for an intelligence agency, using professional tradecraft to avoid detection. The pressure on the investigation team was enormous. The media continued to follow the case closely, and the public demanded answers. How could someone commit so many crimes across so many years without ever being identified? What did this say about the effectiveness of modern law enforcement? As the investigation entered its 16th year, many of the original investigators had retired or been reassigned. The case had become a career-defining challenge for an entire generation of European police officers, and the fact that the Phantom remained uncaught was seen as a profound failure of the system. In March 2009, 16 years after the first DNA evidence had been discovered, investigators made a discovery that would turn the entire case on its head. But this breakthrough didn't come from sophisticated detective work or advanced forensic technology. Instead, it came from a routine administrative discovery that would expose one of the most embarrassing mistakes in forensic history. The revelation began with a seemingly unrelated case in France. Police had discovered the burned body of a man, believed to be an asylum seeker who had gone missing in 2002. During his original application for asylum, the man had submitted fingerprints, which police now planned to use to confirm his identity. Following standard procedure, investigators used cotton swabs to collect DNA samples from the remains. When the results came back from the laboratory, they showed something impossible: the DNA of the Phantom of Heilbronn was present on the burned corpse. This discovery should have been a major breakthrough in the case. But instead, it raised questions that made investigators deeply uncomfortable. How could the Phantom's DNA be found on a body that had been burned beyond recognition? How could she have been connected to a case involving asylum seekers? The more investigators thought about this latest discovery, the more troubling it became. The Phantom's DNA was now being found in situations where her presence made absolutely no logical sense. She had gone from being a prolific criminal to being somehow connected to completely unrelated cases involving people she could never have encountered. It was at this point that investigators began to consider a possibility that had never occurred to them before: what if the Phantom didn't exist at all? The question led them to examine their procedures and protocols with fresh eyes. For 16 years, they had been assuming that the presence of DNA evidence automatically meant that the Phantom had been physically present at each crime scene. But what if the DNA was being introduced to the crime scenes through some other means? This line of thinking led investigators to examine the cotton swabs they had been using to collect DNA samples. These swabs were supposed to be sterile, guaranteed to be free of any genetic material when they arrived at crime scenes. But what if they weren't? The investigation began immediately. Authorities contacted the manufacturer of the cotton swabs they had been using for DNA collection. The company was located in Austria, and it had been supplying forensic cotton swabs to law enforcement agencies across Europe for many years. When investigators examined the manufacturing process, they discovered something that would change forensic science forever. The cotton swabs were indeed sterilized during production, which destroyed bacteria and viruses as intended. But the sterilization process did not remove traces of human DNA. The Phantom's DNA belonged to someone who had worked in the factory where the cotton swabs were manufactured. As she went about her daily work, handling the swabs during production and packaging, she had unknowingly transferred microscopic amounts of her DNA onto the products. The woman behind the DNA was not a criminal mastermind or an international fugitive. She was an elderly Polish factory worker who had been employed at the cotton swab manufacturing facility in Austria. For years, she had gone to work each day, never knowing that her DNA was being distributed across Europe on forensic collection swabs. As she handled the swabs during the manufacturing process, tiny amounts of her skin cells had transferred onto the cotton. These cells contained her DNA, which remained present on the swabs even after the sterilization process. When investigators used these contaminated swabs to collect evidence at crime scenes, they were unknowingly introducing the factory workers' DNA into their samples. The revelation was devastating to the investigation teams that had spent 16 years hunting a Phantom. Every crime scene where her DNA had been found was now suspect. Every piece of evidence that had been collected using those contaminated swabs was potentially compromised. The elderly Polish woman had never committed a crime in her life. She had never been to most of the locations where her DNA had been discovered. She had never met any of the victims, never participated in any of the crimes, and had certainly never murdered a police officer. She was simply a hard-working factory employee who had become an unwitting participant in one of the most massive forensic failures in European history. The discovery explained all of the puzzling aspects of the case. It explained why the Phantom's DNA was found at such a wide variety of crime scenes, because contaminated swabs had been used at all of them. It explained why she was never seen by witnesses or captured on surveillance cameras, because she had never been there. It explained why other criminals denied her existence, because she had never been their accomplice. The case that had consumed thousands of man-hours and millions of euros was based on a fundamental flaw in the forensic collection process. The Phantom that had terrorized Europe for 16 years was nothing more than manufacturing contamination. The revelation that the Phantom of Heilbronn was actually a case of DNA contamination sent shockwaves through the European law enforcement community. The implications were staggering, not just for the specific cases involved, but for the entire field of forensic science. Thousands of criminal cases across Europe had to be re-examined. Any case where DNA evidence had been collected using cotton swabs from the Austrian manufacturer was now potentially compromised. Evidence that had been used to convict criminals, eliminate suspects, and guide investigations was suddenly unreliable. The murder of police officer Michel Kieswetter remained unsolved. The DNA evidence that investigators had believed would lead them to her killer was revealed to be meaningless contamination. Her family, who had hoped that the Phantom investigation would bring them justice, now faced the reality that her killer was still at large. The investigation teams that had devoted years of their careers to hunting the Phantom faced a professional crisis. Many of them had built their reputations on their involvement in this high-profile case. The discovery that their target had never existed was both personally devastating and professionally embarrassing. The media reaction was swift and often harsh. The case became a symbol of forensic overreach and the dangers of relying too heavily on DNA evidence. Critics pointed out that investigators had ignored common sense and conventional police work in favor of chasing genetic evidence that ultimately meant nothing. The factory worker at the center of the contamination was never publicly identified. She had done nothing wrong, she had simply been doing her job, unaware that her DNA was being distributed across Europe. The decision to protect her identity was both legally and ethically appropriate, but it meant that the human face of the Phantom would remain forever unknown. The case exposed fundamental weaknesses in forensic protocols and manufacturing standards. The cotton swabs had been certified as sterile, but sterility only meant freedom from living organisms like bacteria and viruses. There had been no standards requiring that they be free of human DNA. The Phantom of Heilbronn case became a turning point in forensic science, leading to fundamental changes in how DNA evidence is collected, processed, and interpreted. The case demonstrated that even the most sophisticated forensic techniques could be undermined by basic errors in procedure and assumptions. The most immediate change was in manufacturing standards for forensic collection tools. The International Organization for Standardization developed new standards specifically addressing DNA contamination in forensic consumables. ISO 18385 now requires that forensic DNA collection tools be tested to ensure they are free of detectable human DNA. Manufacturers of forensic supplies were forced to completely redesign their production processes. The sterilization procedures that had been considered adequate for medical supplies were revealed to be insufficient for forensic applications. New protocols were developed to ensure that human DNA was completely eliminated from collection tools before they were packaged and distributed. The case also led to changes in how DNA evidence is interpreted by investigators. The assumption that DNA presence automatically means physical presence at a crime scene was revealed to be potentially false. Investigators learned to consider alternative explanations for DNA evidence, including contamination, transfer, and other forms of secondary deposit. Training programs for forensic investigators were updated to include extensive coverage of contamination issues. The Phantom case became a standard example used to teach investigators about the importance of proper procedures and the dangers of over-relying on single types of evidence. The scientific community began to take contamination issues more seriously. Research was conducted into how DNA could be transferred between surfaces, how long it could survive in different environments, and what factors might affect its detection. This research led to a better understanding of the limitations and proper interpretation of DNA evidence. Quality control procedures in forensic laboratories were strengthened. New protocols were developed to test for contamination, verify the integrity of collection tools, and ensure that proper procedures were followed at every step of the evidence processing chain. The case also had broader implications for criminal justice. It demonstrated how investigative teams could become so focused on one type of evidence that they ignored other important factors. The Phantom investigation had consumed enormous resources that could have been used to solve other crimes, including the murder of Officer Kieswetter. While the world focused on the Phantom investigation, real crimes were being committed by actual criminals. The DNA contamination had created a false pattern that distracted investigators from identifying the true perpetrators of these offenses. The murder of police officer Michelle Kieswetter remained unsolved for years after the Phantom revelation. Without the contaminated DNA evidence, investigators had to start over, looking for new leads and evidence that might identify her actual killer. The case eventually led to the discovery of a neo-Nazi terrorist cell, but that breakthrough came years later and through entirely different investigative methods. The burglaries, robberies, and other crimes that had been attributed to the Phantom were revealed to be the work of multiple different criminals. Each crime had to be reinvestigated, with investigators looking for evidence that hadn't been contaminated by the manufacturing process. Some of the criminals who had been linked to Phantom crimes through the contaminated DNA evidence had actually been telling the truth when they denied the existence of a female accomplice. Their testimony had been dismissed because the DNA evidence seemed so conclusive, but they had been accurately describing their crimes all along. The case highlighted the dangers of over-relying on any single type of evidence, no matter how sophisticated it might appear. DNA evidence had been considered the gold standard of forensic science, but the Phantom case demonstrated that even the most advanced techniques could be compromised by basic procedural errors. Investigators learned to be more skeptical of evidence that seemed too convenient or that didn't fit with other aspects of a case. The Phantom's DNA had been found at such a wide variety of crime scenes that it should have raised questions about whether one person could realistically be involved in so many different types of crimes. The case also demonstrated the importance of maintaining proper chain of custody and quality control procedures. If investigators had been more careful about verifying the integrity of their collection tools, the contamination might have been discovered much earlier. The Phantom of Heilbronn case had implications that extended far beyond the specific crimes and investigations involved. It became a watershed moment that changed how the criminal justice system approached DNA evidence and forensic science in general. Public confidence in forensic science was significantly impacted by the revelation. The Phantom case was widely publicized, and it made people more aware of the potential for errors in forensic analysis. This skepticism was both beneficial and problematic. While it led to more careful scrutiny of evidence, it also made it more difficult for prosecutors to use legitimate DNA evidence in court. The legal system had to grapple with the implications of the contamination. Defense attorneys began challenging DNA evidence more aggressively, using the Phantom case as an example of how supposedly infallible forensic techniques could be completely wrong. Courts had to develop new standards for evaluating the reliability of DNA evidence. The case influenced criminal justice policy at the highest levels. Government agencies responsible for regulating forensic science implemented new oversight procedures and quality control standards. The Phantom case became a standard example used in training programs for judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. International cooperation in criminal investigations was also affected. The Phantom case had demonstrated both the benefits and dangers of sharing forensic evidence across borders. While cooperation was essential for tracking criminals who operated in multiple countries, the case showed how errors could be amplified when they were shared internationally. The scientific community responded with increased research into contamination issues and evidence reliability. Journals published numerous papers analyzing the Phantom case and its implications. The case became a standard reference point for discussions about forensic science reliability and the importance of proper procedures. The media coverage of the case raised public awareness about both the power and the limitations of forensic science. The Phantom had captured the public imagination as a mysterious criminal, but the revelation that she didn't exist highlighted the importance of critical thinking about evidence and investigation. Behind the headlines and scientific discussions about the Phantom of Heilbronn case were real human costs that extended far beyond the monetary expenses of the investigation. The case affected countless lives in ways that were both visible and hidden. The family of police officer Michelle Kieswetter endured years of false hope and disappointment. They had been led to believe that her killer was being actively pursued through the Phantom investigation, only to discover that this entire line of inquiry was meaningless. The real investigation into her murder had been delayed by years, prolonging their suffering and denying them the justice they deserved. The investigators who had devoted their careers to hunting the Phantom faced professional and personal crises. Many of them had built their reputations on their involvement in this high-profile case. The discovery that their target had never existed was devastating to their professional credibility and personal sense of accomplishment. The elderly Polish factory worker who had unknowingly provided the DNA lived in fear after the contamination was discovered. Although she had committed no crimes, she was terrified that she would be blamed for the investigative failure or targeted by criminals who might think she had been informing on them. Real crime victims had been denied justice while resources were diverted to the Phantom investigation. The thousands of man-hours and millions of euros spent chasing a non-existent criminal could have been used to solve actual crimes and bring real criminals to justice. The broader law enforcement community suffered a loss of credibility and public trust. The Phantom case became a symbol of investigative failure and forensic overreach. Police departments across Europe had to work to rebuild public confidence in their abilities and procedures. The criminal justice system as a whole was affected by the revelation. Defense attorneys used the Phantom case to challenge DNA evidence in other cases, potentially allowing guilty criminals to escape justice. The case created a cloud of suspicion over an entire category of evidence that had previously been considered nearly infallible. As we reach the end of this remarkable story, it's worth reflecting on what the Phantom of Heilbronn case teaches us about the nature of evidence, investigation, and truth itself. This case challenges our assumptions about the reliability of scientific evidence and the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism even in the face of seemingly conclusive proof. The Phantom was real in every sense except the most important one. Her DNA was genuine, her genetic signature was consistent, and the evidence of her presence at crime scenes was scientifically valid. But she existed only as a shadow created by a flaw in the system, a ghost born from contamination and sustained by assumption. The Phantom of Heilbronn was described as a hypothesized unknown female serial killer whose existence was inferred from DNA evidence found at numerous crime scenes in Austria, France, and Germany from 1993 to 2009. The DNA had been recovered from 40 crime scenes, ranging from murders to burglaries. The Phantom's DNA belonged to an elderly Polish factory worker, who had worked the production line where the swabs were produced. Her DNA had contaminated the swabs and found its way into various crime scenes across Europe. The case reminds us that even the most advanced scientific techniques are only as reliable as the procedures and assumptions that support them. The DNA recovered at the crime scenes had already been present on the cotton swabs prior to being used for collecting DNA samples, creating a false pattern that consumed 16 years of investigation. The story of the Phantom of Heilbronn is ultimately a human story about the search for truth in an uncertain world. It's about dedicated investigators who pursued what they believed was justice, a factory worker who unknowingly became part of criminal history, and victims who deserved better than the system provided. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that the most compelling mysteries are often the ones that reveal the limits of our knowledge and the importance of questioning even our most confident assumptions. The Phantom may not have been real, but the lessons she taught us about evidence, investigation, and the pursuit of truth will endure long after her ghost has been laid to rest. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.